What would you do if your billionaire husband slapped your pregnant sister at her own wedding? Victoria thought she knew the man she married. But when FBI agents raided their penthouse and accused her of stealing $57 million from retirees, she discovered her entire marriage was a lie. Her perfect life built on stolen money. Her loving husband, a serial con artist who had destroyed three other women before her. Now Victoria faces federal prison for crimes she never knew were happening, while her husband escapes to international waters with his real wife. This is the shocking true story of how one woman fought back against the perfect trap. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will change how you think about trust. And don't forget to subscribe because stories like this could save lives. The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Napa Valley estate, crystalline fragments catching the afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. 200 wedding guests gasped in collective horror as Bradford Montgomery's hand hung frozen in the air, his face twisted with rage. Madison Hayes Parker, 6 months pregnant and radiant in her ivory gown, stumbled backward, her hand pressed against her reddening cheek. The wedding reception fell into deathly silence except for the distant sound of someone's phone hitting the ground. Victoria Hayes Montgomery stood paralyzed, watching her billionaire husband strike her pregnant sister. The scene unfolded in slow motion, each second burning itself into her memory. Bradford's expensive Italian suit, Madison's shocked tears, the horrified faces of their family and friends, all frozen in a tableau of violence that would destroy everything. "How dare you?" Bradford snarled at Madison, his voice carrying across the reception terrace. "How dare you question my business practices at my own sister-in-law's wedding?" Victoria's mind reeled. Sister-in-law's wedding. This was Madison's wedding. Bradford's words made no sense, but the cold fury in his voice was terrifyingly familiar. She had seen glimpses of this rage before, carefully hidden behind closed doors, but never this public, never this violent. Father Jonathan Hayes, still wearing his ceremonial robes from performing the ceremony, pushed through the crowd of guests. His face was pale with shock and barely contained anger as he reached his younger sister Madison. "Step away from her," Jonathan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of both his religious calling and his previous career as a prosecutor. "Now," Bradford's laugh was sharp and bitter. "The priest wants to play hero. How touching. Your whole family thinks they're so much better than everyone else." Victoria finally found her voice. "Bradford, what are you doing?" Madison didn't say anything wrong. She just asked about your business trip to the Caymans. The look Bradford turned on Victoria made her blood freeze. In 8 years of marriage, she had never seen such pure contempt in his eyes. It was as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time and finding her utterly worthless. "Shut up, Victoria," he said quietly, his voice more frightening than any shout. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You never do." Around them, wedding guests began pulling out their phones. Victoria could see the little red recording lights, dozens of them, capturing every moment of their family's humiliation. By tomorrow, this would be viral. By next week, it would define them forever. Madison's new husband, Jake Parker, stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You need to leave, now, before I call the police." "The police?" Bradford's smile was predatory. "That's interesting. You might want to reconsider that threat." Victoria felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Something was very wrong here. Something beyond Bradford's inexplicable violence. The way he spoke about the police, the strange confidence in his voice, despite having just committed assault in front of 200 witnesses. The cryptic comment about his business trip. Jonathan placed a protective arm around Madison, who was quietly crying, one hand cradling her pregnant belly. "Victoria, we need to talk. Privately. Right now." But Bradford was already walking away, straightening his tie as if nothing had happened. "Victoria, we're leaving. Get your purse." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Victoria said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Not after what you just did." Bradford stopped and turned back, his smile cold enough to freeze blood. "Yes, you are. Because if you don't, you're going to regret it for the rest of your very short, very poor life." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Victoria looked at her sister's tear-stained face, at her brother's worried expression, at the sea of shocked guests, and realized that her perfect life was about to collapse in ways she couldn't even imagine. 6 hours earlier, She had been Mrs. Bradford Montgomery, wife of a tech billionaire, living in a world of private jets and designer gowns. Now, watching her husband walk away with the casual confidence of a man who had just destroyed everything, Victoria understood that she had never really known him at all. The recording phones continued to roll, capturing every moment of her humiliation. By tomorrow, the whole world would see the moment her marriage died, 6 hours before the slap that would change everything. Victoria Hayes Montgomery stood in the bridal suite of the Silverado Resort, helping her sister Madison into her wedding dress. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the Napa Valley in shades of gold and green. "I still can't believe you married Bradford," Madison said, adjusting her veil in the antique mirror. "I mean, I know he's successful and everything, but sometimes when he looks at you, it's like he's calculating your value." Victoria's hands stilled on Madison's buttons. "What do you mean, Matt?" "Nothing specific. Just a feeling. Like at Christmas when you mentioned wanting to go back to marketing, and he shut it down so quickly. Or how he always has to approve what you wear to his company events." Victoria forced a laugh, but her sister's words hit uncomfortably close to home. "He just has strong opinions about image. When you're a public figure like Bradford, everything matters." "You're a public figure too, Victoria. You used to run marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies. You had your own life before him." Before Victoria could respond, Bradford's voice echoed from the hallway. "Victoria, where are you? We need to discuss the seating arrangements." Mom, Madison rolled her eyes. "See what I mean? It's your sister's wedding, not a board meeting." Victoria opened the door to find Bradford impeccably dressed in his charcoal gray suit. His phone pressed to his ear. He held up one finger, indicating she should wait while he finished his call. "I don't care what the timeline was originally," he said into the phone, saying, his voice sharp with irritation. "The situation has changed. We need to accelerate everything by 72 hours. Victoria frowned. Bradford's tech company had been working on some kind of expansion lately, but he had been unusually secretive about the details. Normally, he loved discussing his business victories, using them as opportunities to demonstrate his superior intelligence and strategic thinking. "No, she doesn't know anything," Bradford continued, his eyes meeting Victoria's for a moment. "She's not a problem. Neither of them are problems. They're just temporary complications." A chill ran down Victoria's spine. Who was he talking about, and what did he mean by temporary complications? Bradford ended his call and slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. "Sorry about that. Crisis at the office. You know how it is." "Actually, I don't know how it is," Victoria said carefully. "You haven't told me anything about what's been happening at Montgomery Tech lately. Every time I ask, you change the subject." Bradford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Business is complicated, sweetheart. You wouldn't understand the technical aspects. That's why I handle all our financial matters. It's better that way." The dismissal stung, but Victoria had learned not to push when Bradford used that tone. 8 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the warning signs of his displeasure. "Now," Bradford continued, "about the seating arrangements. I need you to make sure Detective Stone and her husband are moved to table 12, away from our table." "Detective Stone, I don't remember anyone by that name on the guest list. She's Jake's cousin, police officer from San Francisco. I'd prefer not to spend the evening discussing law enforcement with some small-town detective." Victoria nodded, though something about his explanation felt off. Bradford had never been shy about networking with powerful people, regardless of their profession. If anything, having a police detective at their table would normally appeal to his desire to cultivate influential connections. Her phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was listed as A. Collins, but Victoria didn't recognize the number. "Emergency at the office. Need you here ASAP. The SEC situation is escalating." Victoria stared at the message, confused. "Bradford, someone named Collins just texted me about an SEC situation. They seem to think I work at your company." Bradford's face went white, then quickly reddened with anger. He snatched the phone from her hands, his grip tight enough to hurt. "Wrong number," he said, deleting the message. "Just spam. You know how these scammers work. They send random texts hoping to get personal information." But Victoria had seen the flash of panic in his eyes before he masked it with irritation. A. Collins wasn't a scammer. They knew her name, knew about Bradford's company, and they were discussing the Securities and Exchange Commission. Bradford, what's going on? Why would someone be texting me about SEC issues? Nothing's going on, he snapped. Can we focus on your sister's wedding instead of imaginary business crises? From inside the bridal suite, Madison called out, Victoria, can you help me with this necklace? Victoria looked at her husband's tense face, at the phone he was still gripping like a weapon, and made a decision that would change everything. We'll talk about this later, she said quietly. No, Bradford replied, his voice carrying a finality that made her skin crawl. We won't. As Victoria returned to help her sister, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and someone was about to push her over. Father Jonathan Hayes stood at the altar of St. Helena Catholic Church, watching his youngest sister Madison walk down the aisle toward her future husband. At 42, Jonathan had performed dozens of weddings, but this one felt different, special. Madison glowed with the kind of happiness that made everyone around her smile. But as his eyes swept over the congregation, Jonathan's gaze lingered on his middle sister Victoria, seated in the front row beside her husband Bradford Montgomery. Even from the altar, Jonathan could see the tension in Victoria's shoulders, the way she held herself rigidly upright as if afraid to relax. Bradford sat beside her like a statue, his expression politely attentive but emotionally absent. Jonathan had never liked the man, though he kept his opinions to himself out of respect for Victoria's choices. But something about Bradford had always struck him as fundamentally wrong, like a perfectly painted facade hiding something rotten underneath. Dearly beloved, Jonathan began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Madison Louise Hayes and Jacob Michael Parker in holy matrimony. As he spoke the familiar words, Jonathan's mind wandered to a conversation he'd had with Victoria 3 months earlier. She had called him late at night, crying, asking if it was normal for married couples to sleep in separate bedrooms. Bradford says he needs undisturbed sleep for his work, Victoria had explained through her tears. But Jonathan, we haven't been intimate in over a year. I feel like I'm living with a stranger who tolerates my presence. Jonathan had tried to counsel her, suggesting marriage therapy or a weekend retreat for couples. But Victoria had quickly backtracked, making excuses for Bradford's behavior and insisting that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. Jonathan could see it in the way Bradford controlled every aspect of Victoria's life, from her clothes to her social activities to her career aspirations. When Victoria had mentioned wanting to return to marketing, Bradford had dismissed the idea so completely that she never brought it up again. The rings, please, Jonathan said, bringing his attention back to the ceremony. Jake and Madison exchanged rings with the kind of genuine emotion that made Jonathan's heart swell. This was what marriage should look like. Partnership, mutual respect, joy that couldn't be contained. After the ceremony, as guests moved to the reception at the Silverado Resort, Jonathan found himself walking beside Detective Rachel Stone, Jake's cousin from San Francisco. Rachel was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who specialized in financial crimes. Beautiful ceremony, Father, Rachel said. Your sister looks radiant. Thank you. Both my sisters are remarkable women. I've heard about Victoria's husband, Bradford Montgomery, right? The tech mogul. Something in Rachel's tone made Jonathan pause. You know Bradford? Not personally, but his company's been on our radar for a few months. Financial irregularities, nothing concrete yet, but enough to keep us interested. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. What kind of irregularities? I probably shouldn't say, but Father, if your sister ever needs help, ever needs someone to talk to about her husband's business practices, she should call me. Rachel handed him her business card. Day or night, the reception was held on the resort's outdoor terrace, overlooking the valley. Jonathan mingled with guests, performed his social duties, but Rachel's words echoed in his mind. Financial irregularities, Bradford's company under investigation. During dinner, Jonathan watched Bradford carefully. The man was charming, telling amusing stories about Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and tech industry trends, but there was something performative about it, as if Bradford was playing a role rather than being himself. Victoria barely spoke during the meal. She smiled when appropriate, laughed at Bradford's stories, but Jonathan could see the strain around her eyes. His sister was unhappy, and Jonathan was beginning to suspect it went much deeper than marital problems. After the main course, Jonathan excused himself and walked to a quiet corner of the terrace to check his phone. He had 3 missed calls from an unknown number and a voicemail that made his blood run cold. Father Hayes, this is Amber Collins from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We need to speak with you about your brother-in-law, Bradford Montgomery, immediately. There's been a development in our investigation that directly affects your sister Victoria's safety. Please call me back as soon as you receive this message. Jonathan's hands shook as he dialed the number. Amber Collins answered on the first ring. Father Hayes, thank God you called. We've been trying to reach you for hours. What's going on? Is Victoria in danger? We have reason to believe that Bradford Montgomery has been embezzling money from his company's pension fund. We're talking about $50 million, Father, and we think he's planning to flee the country tonight. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Tonight, but it's my sister's wedding. We think he's using the wedding as cover. All his family and friends are here, giving him the perfect alibi while his accomplice transfers the money offshore. Father, we need your help. Victoria could be charged as an accessory if we can't prove she was unaware of his crimes. Jonathan closed his eyes, thinking of Victoria's financial dependence on Bradford, her complete trust in his business decisions, her isolation from their previous career and friends. What do you need me to do? We need someone Bradford trusts to get him talking, someone he won't suspect, someone who could wear a wire. You want me to betray my brother-in-law at my sister's wedding? We want you to save your sister from spending the rest of her life in federal prison. Jonathan looked through the terrace doors at Victoria, sitting beside Bradford, both of them smiling for wedding photos. His sister had no idea that her husband was a criminal, no idea that her entire life was built on stolen money, no idea that in a few hours, everything she thought she knew would be destroyed. Tell me what you need me to do, Jonathan said quietly. But as he spoke the words, a commotion erupted inside the reception hall. Through the glass doors, Jonathan saw Bradford standing over Madison, his hand raised, his face twisted with rage. And then he struck her. The investigative plan became irrelevant in an instant. Bradford Montgomery had just revealed his true nature to 200 witnesses, and there was no hiding from the storm that was about to break. The aftermath of the slap felt surreal. Victoria stood frozen as wedding guests erupted into chaos around her. Some people were rushing toward Madison, others were backing away in shock, and at least 20 phones were recording every second of the disaster. Bradford straightened his tie with casual indifference, as if he had just swatted a fly rather than struck a pregnant woman at her own wedding reception. The transformation was complete and terrifying. The charming billionaire who had delivered a heartfelt toast just an hour earlier had vanished, replaced by someone cold and calculating. Victoria, Bradford said calmly, get your purse. We're leaving. I'm not going anywhere with you, Victoria replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Not after what you just did to my sister. Madison was crying quietly, one hand pressed to her cheek while Jake and Jonathan flanked her protectively. The red mark from Bradford's hand was already beginning to swell. You hit a pregnant woman, Victoria continued, her voice rising. At her own wedding, in front of everyone. What's wrong with you? Bradford's laugh was sharp and mirthless. What's wrong with me, Victoria? Sweetheart, you have no idea what's about to happen. But if you come with me right now, quietly, I might be able to protect you from the worst of it. Protect me from what? From the consequences of being married to me. The cryptic response sent ice through Victoria's veins. Around them, she could hear guests murmuring, phones clicking as photos were taken, the distant sound of sirens. Someone had called the police. Detective Rachel Stone appeared at Victoria's elbow, her badge visible on her belt. Mr. Montgomery, I'm going to need you to stay here until the local officers arrive. Bradford studied Rachel with calculating eyes. Detective Stone, isn't it Jake's cousin from San Francisco? How convenient that you're here, but not convenient, lucky, for Victoria. Is it? Bradford smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Tell me, detective, how much do you know about insider trading, about pension fund embezzlement, about the fascinating ways that money can disappear from corporate accounts? Victoria felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Bradford, what are you talking about? Your husband, Rachel said quietly, has been stealing money from his employees' retirement funds. $50 million. Victoria. And all of it has been flowing through accounts with your name on them. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Accounts with her name, stolen money, $50 million. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. I don't have access to any business accounts. I don't even know the passwords to our personal banking. No, Bradford said with mock sympathy. But your social security number, your maiden name, your mother's maiden name, all the personal information that makes perfect identity verification for offshore accounts. Amazing what a trusting wife will provide when she thinks she's just updating insurance paperwork. Victoria stared at her husband in horror. Every document she had signed, every form she had filled out at his request, every time she had provided personal information for what he claimed were routine business purposes, he had been building a criminal enterprise using her identity as cover. The federal agents will be here within the hour, Rachel continued. Mr. Montgomery, I strongly suggest you cooperate with the investigation. Federal agents. Bradford checked his expensive watch. Actually, Detective, I think you'll find that I'm no longer your problem. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text message. Within seconds, Victoria could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching. You see, Bradford said conversationally, I've been planning for this contingency for quite some time. Offshore accounts, new identities, transportation arrangements. The only variable was timing, and thanks to your sister's inconvenient wedding, I had to accelerate the schedule slightly. Jonathan stepped forward, his face pale with anger. You're talking about fleeing the country, about abandoning Victoria after framing her for your crimes. Framing is such an ugly word. Father, I prefer to think of it as ensuring adequate fall coverage for my exit strategy. Victoria felt her knees wobble. You're leaving me here to face federal charges for crimes I didn't commit. Victoria, darling, you signed the documents. Your name is on the accounts. Your social security number authorizes the transfers. From a legal standpoint, you're as guilty as I am. The helicopter was getting closer, its rotors creating a downdraft that sent wedding decorations flying across the terrace. Through the chaos, Victoria saw a blonde woman in an expensive black dress walking purposefully toward them. Amber Collins, the woman said, extending her hand to Bradford. Everything's ready for departure. Victoria recognized the name from the mysterious text message she had received that morning. A. Collins, emergency at the office, the SEC situation. You're not with the SEC, Victoria said, pieces falling into place. You work for Bradford? Amber smiled. Actually, with Mrs. Montgomery. I am Bradford, legally speaking. We were married 2 years ago in the Cayman Islands. You, on the other hand, are what we call the useful accomplice. The revelation hit Victoria like a tsunami. Bigamy. Her entire marriage was illegal. She wasn't Bradford's wife. She was his victim, his unwitting criminal partner, and his designated scapegoat. The helicopter landed on the resort's helicopter pad, its rotors still spinning. Bradford straightened his jacket and checked his watch again. Time to go, he said to Amber. The federal warrant will be issued within 30 minutes, and I'd prefer to be in international waters by then. Victoria found her voice. What about everything we built together, our home, our life, our marriage? We never had a marriage. Victoria, we had a business arrangement. You provided social legitimacy and criminal cover. I provided financial security and luxury lifestyle. But the arrangement has reached its natural conclusion. Bradford started walking toward the helicopter, then paused and turned back. Victoria, I want you to know that you served your purpose admirably. You were the perfect trophy wife. Beautiful, trusting, completely uninterested in business details. You made it remarkably easy to build a criminal enterprise without scrutiny. As the helicopter lifted off with Bradford and Amber aboard, Victoria stood surrounded by her shattered family, wedding guests, and the debris of her demolished life, finally understanding that she had never really known her husband at all. The man she had loved for 8 years had been a complete fiction, and now she was left to face the consequences of crimes she never knew she was committing. 3 hours after Bradford's dramatic helicopter escape, Victoria sat in the Napa County Sheriff's Office, still wearing her blue silk wedding guest dress, Now wrinkled and stained with tears, FBI agents had arrived from San Francisco, transforming Madison's wedding reception into a federal crime scene. Detective Rachel Stone sat across from Victoria in the small interview room, a thick folder of documents spread between them. Jonathan sat beside his sister, no longer in his ceremonial robes but wearing the serious expression of someone who had seen too much suffering. Victoria, Rachel began gently, I need you to understand the scope of what Bradford has done. This isn't just embezzlement. This is a sophisticated criminal enterprise that has been operating for at least 3 years. Victoria stared at the documents spread across the table. Bank statements, wire transfer records, corporate filings, all bearing her forged signature or personal information. Montgomery Tech never existed as anything more than a shell company. Rachel continued. Bradford created it to legitimize the pension fund investments. He convinced 12 different companies to transfer their employee retirement funds to his management, $57 million in total. Where did the money go? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. All established using your personal information as the beneficial owner. Jonathan leaned forward. Rachel, can you verify that Victoria had no knowledge of these activities? That's what we're hoping. Victoria, I need you to walk me through your marriage. Everything. How Bradford controlled your finances, your access to information, your daily activities. Victoria closed her eyes, thinking back over 8 years of marriage. He handled everything, all our banking, investments, dayfeatures, even our household bills. He said it was more efficient that way, and I trusted him. Did you ever question his business activities? I tried to, especially in the last year, when he became more secretive. But whenever I asked questions, he made me feel stupid for not understanding. He said business was too complicated for me to follow. Rachel nodded, making notes. Classic financial abuse pattern, isolation, dependency, gaslighting. What about social activities, friends' career? He discouraged me from maintaining friendships with people from my marketing career, said they were jealous of our success and would try to undermine our marriage. The only social events we attended were related to his business or his choice of charities. Victoria, Jonathan said softly, do you remember when you wanted to go back to work last year? Victoria nodded, fresh tears starting. I missed having my own career, my own income. But Bradford said it would look bad for his image if his wife had to work. He said it would make people think he couldn't provide for his family. Rachel exchanged a meaningful look with Jonathan. Victoria, we need to discuss something difficult. Bradford's marriage to Amber Collins in the Cayman Islands means your marriage to him was never legal. You're not actually his wife. The words should have been devastating, but Victoria felt an unexpected wave of relief. So I'm not responsible for his debts, his legal problems. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Your name is on multiple financial documents. You'll need an excellent criminal defense attorney, and you'll likely face federal charges unless we can prove your complete innocence. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Check the local news. You're famous now. Hope it was worth it. Rachel frowned. Who has your number besides family? I have no idea. Jonathan was already pulling up news websites on his phone. His face went pale as he read, Victoria, you need to see this. The headline on the San Francisco Chronicle website read, Tech CEO's wife involved in $50 million pension fund scam. Below it was a photo of Victoria and Bradford at a charity gala, smiling and holding champagne glasses. They're making me look like an accomplice, Victoria said, reading the article with growing horror. Listen to this. Victoria Hayes Montgomery, wife of fugitive CEO Bradford Montgomery, lived a lifestyle of luxury funded by stolen retirement money. Sources close to the investigation suggest Mrs. Montgomery was heavily involved in the offshore money laundering operation. Sources close to the investigation. Rachel shook her head angrily. No one from our team spoke to the media. Someone's deliberately trying to make you look guilty. Victoria's phone rang. The caller ID showed Mom. Victoria, honey, what's happening? Her mother's voice was tight with worry. I'm seeing terrible things on the news. They're saying you stole money from retirees. Mom, I can't really talk right now. But I need you to know that I had nothing to do with Bradford's crimes. I'm as much a victim as anyone else. Are you safe? Where are you? Victoria looked around the sheriff's office, at the FBI agents walking past the interview room, at the federal warrant paperwork on the table. I'm safe for now. Jonathan's with me. After hanging up, Victoria turned to Rachel. What happens next? We build a case proving your innocence. We trace every transaction, every signature, every decision that Bradford made without your knowledge or consent. But Victoria, I need you to be prepared for this to get much worse before it gets better. Worse how, Bradford's helicopter landed on a private yacht 12 miles offshore, international waters. By now, he and Amber are probably halfway into a non-extradition country, which means you're the only person left to face federal prosecution for his crimes. Victoria felt the walls of the small room closing in around her. So he gets away with everything, and I go to prison for crimes I didn't commit. Not if I can help it, Rachel said firmly. But Victoria, I need you to tell me everything. Every conversation, every document you signed, every time Bradford asked you for personal information. We're going to prove that you were a victim of sophisticated financial fraud, not a willing participant. Jonathan took Victoria's hand. We'll get through this together. I promise. But as Victoria looked at the mountain of evidence bearing her forged signatures, as she read news articles portraying her as a criminal mastermind, as she contemplated the possibility of spending decades in federal prison for crimes she never knew were being committed, she wondered if promises would be enough to save her from the trap Bradford had so carefully constructed. Her perfect life had been revealed as an elaborate lie, and now she was fighting for her freedom against evidence that had been manufactured by the man she had trusted most in the world. Victoria's freedom lasted exactly 16 hours after Bradford's escape. At 6 a.m., FBI agents arrived at the Hayes family home where she had spent the night after the wedding disaster. The arrest warrant charged her with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Victoria Hayes Montgomery, Agent Patricia Walsh announced, "You're under arrest for federal financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent." Victoria barely heard the Miranda warning of the roaring in her ears. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But the handcuffs were cold and hard around her wrists, and the neighbors' shocked faces peering from their windows made the nightmare undeniably real. The federal courthouse in San Francisco felt like a different planet. Victoria, now wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of designer clothes, sat beside her court-appointed attorney in a sterile room that smelled of fear and desperation. "The evidence against you is substantial," Attorney David Cooper admitted, spreading documents across the metal table. "Your signatures on dozens of financial documents, your social security number authorizing wire transfers, your personal information used to establish offshore accounts." "But I explained all that," Victoria protested. "Bradford forged my signatures. He used my personal information without my knowledge." Proving forgery is extremely difficult, especially when the documents were created over several years. The prosecution argues that no one could commit fraud of this magnitude without their spouse's knowledge and participation. Victoria's stomach twisted with fear. What about Bradford's bigamous marriage to Amber Collins? Doesn't that prove I was deceived? It proves Bradford was committing bigamy, but it doesn't prove you were unaware of the financial crimes. The prosecution's theory is that you discovered the illegal marriage and demanded a larger share of the stolen money to keep quiet. The accusation was so absurd that Victoria almost laughed. Almost. But nothing about her situation was funny anymore. "Mr. Cooper, what's the worst-case scenario?" "Federal prison, 20 to 30 years, complete forfeiture of all assets." "Victoria, I need you to understand that the government has built an extremely strong case against you." That afternoon, Victoria's bail hearing became a media circus. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, reporters shouting questions as she was led inside. "Mrs. Montgomery, did you know your husband was stealing pension money?" "Victoria, what do you say to the retirees who lost their savings? Is it true you're planning to flee the country like your husband?" Inside the courtroom, Federal Judge Maria Rodriguez reviewed Victoria's case with obvious skepticism. "Mrs. Montgomery, the government has presented compelling evidence that you were an active participant in a sophisticated financial fraud scheme." "Your Honor," Attorney Cooper replied, "my client was a victim of financial abuse and manipulation. She had no knowledge of her husband's criminal activities." "Mr. Cooper, your client's signature appears on 47 separate financial documents over 3 years. Are you suggesting she signed all of these unknowingly? Victoria wanted to scream that yes, that's exactly what happened. That Bradford had presented each document as routine paperwork for insurance, taxes, or investment management. That she had trusted her husband completely and never questioned his explanations. But she could see the doubt in Judge Rodriguez's eyes, the same doubt she had been seeing everywhere since her arrest. Bail is set at $2 million, the judge announced. The defendant will surrender her passport and remain under house arrest with electronic monitoring. $2 million. Victoria had no access to any money. Bradford had controlled all their accounts, and everything was now frozen by federal authorities. That evening, Victoria sat in her cell at the San Francisco County Jail, wearing the orange jumpsuit that had become her new uniform. Her cellmate was a woman named Carmen, convicted of check fraud, who listened with surprising compassion as Victoria explained her situation. "Honey, Nain," Carmen said, "you got played by a master. My ex did something similar, but smaller scale. These men, they're like artists. They paint a picture so beautiful you never see the ugliness underneath. How do I prove I'm innocent when all the evidence says I'm guilty? You find the crack in their perfect plan. There's always a crack. These narcissist types, they can't help showing off their cleverness to someone." Victoria thought about Bradford's final words at the wedding reception, his casual revelation about using her identity, his obvious pleasure in explaining how completely he had deceived her. He did show off, Victoria realized. At the wedding, in front of everyone, he explained exactly how he had used me. Were people recording? Everyone was recording. There must be dozens of videos of that conversation. Carmen smiled. Then you've got your crack. Honey, nobody confesses to framing someone unless they're telling the truth about the framing. The next morning brought more devastating news. Victoria's photo was on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. The headlines were brutal. The trophy wife's $50 million secret, living high on stolen retirement money, from Silicon Valley princess to federal fugitive. Jonathan arrived for visiting hours looking exhausted and worried. "Victoria, I have news. Some good, some terrible. Give me the terrible first." Madison lost the baby. The stress from the wedding incident, combined with the media circus, caused a miscarriage. She's in the hospital. Victoria felt her heart shatter completely. Madison's pregnancy had been a source of joy for their entire family, and now that joy was gone because of Bradford's violence and Victoria's unwitting involvement in his crimes. What's the good news? Rachel Stone has been investigating Bradford's background, his real background. Victoria, Bradford Montgomery isn't his real name. Victoria stared at her brother through the scratched plexiglass that separated them. What do you mean his real name is Brian Matthews? He's done this before. Twice? Different states, different victims, same pattern, marriage, financial fraud, escape, leaving the wife to face criminal charges. There are other women like me, two that we know of. Both served time in federal prison for crimes their husband committed. Both maintained their innocence. But the evidence against them was overwhelming. Just like the evidence against me. Exactly like the evidence against you. Victoria, Bradford is a professional con artist who specializes in financial fraud using intimate partner manipulation. You're not his first victim. You're his third. Victoria closed her eyes, processing this information. 3 women, 3 marriages, 3 elaborate criminal schemes, 3 lives destroyed while Bradford escaped with stolen money and new identities. Can this help my case? Rachel thinks so. If we can prove a pattern of behavior, if we can find the other victims and get them to testify about Bradford's methods, we might be able to demonstrate that you were manipulated using identical techniques. For the first time since her arrest, Victoria felt a flicker of hope. But even as she clung to that hope, she knew that Bradford had spent years perfecting his methods. He was a professional criminal who had successfully destroyed 3 women's lives without facing any consequences. And now it was her turn to fight for her freedom against a system that had already been convinced of her guilt by the evidence Bradford had so carefully planted. The question wasn't whether Bradford was guilty. The question was whether Victoria could prove her innocence before his perfect plan sent her to federal prison for the rest of her life. Victoria's salvation came from an unexpected source, A Facebook message from a woman named Jennifer Walsh, sent to Jonathan's church account 3 days after Victoria's arrest. Father Hayes, I read about your sister's situation in the news. I believe I was married to the same man who destroyed her life. His name wasn't Bradford Montgomery when I knew him. It was Benjamin Martin. But the pattern is identical. Please contact me immediately. Jennifer Walsh lived in Portland, Oregon, and her story made Victoria's blood run cold. 5 years earlier, she had been married to a charming tech entrepreneur named Benjamin Martin, who had swept her off her feet with his wealth and confidence. He told me he was developing revolutionary software for financial management. Jennifer explained during a video call with Victoria, Jonathan, and Rachel Stone. He convinced me to let him manage all our finances because his investment strategies were so sophisticated. Victoria felt like she was looking into a mirror. Did he make you feel stupid for not understanding business? Constantly. Whenever I asked questions about our money, he made me feel like I was being paranoid and distrustful. He said successful marriages required complete financial unity and trust. What happened to your career? Victoria asked. He convinced me to quit my job as a marketing director, said his wife shouldn't have to work, that it reflected poorly on his success. By the time I realized what was happening, I had been out of the workforce for 3 years and had no independent income. Rachel leaned forward. Jennifer, tell us about the criminal charges you faced. Jennifer's expression darkened. Benjamin had been embezzling money from his business partner's investment accounts, $14 million. When the FBI arrested him, they arrested me too. My name was on all the offshore accounts. My signatures were on all the transfer documents. But you didn't know about the crimes. I had no idea. Just like Victoria, I thought I was signing routine paperwork for taxes and insurance. But Benjamin had trained me over years of marriage to sign whatever he put in front of me without reading it carefully. Victoria felt sick. Did you go to prison? 2 years in federal prison. Benjamin fled the country before his trial. I served time for crimes I didn't commit. Lost our house, lost my savings, lost my reputation. When I got out, I had nothing. Jonathan shook his head in disgust. How many times has he done this? Rachel consulted her notes. We've identified 3 previous victims, Jennifer in Portland, Caroline Stevens in Chicago, and Michelle Torres in Miami. Same pattern every time: whirlwind romance. Quick marriage, financial control, embezzlement using the wife's identity, dramatic escape, leaving the wife to face federal prosecution. What happened to the other women? Victoria asked. Carolyn served 3 years. Michelle served 4 years. All 3 women maintained their innocence, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. Victoria felt the weight of history pressing down on her. So Bradford, or Benjamin, or whatever his real name is, he's destroyed 4 women's lives and never faced any consequences. Not yet, Rachel said grimly. But we're going to change that. Jennifer's testimony became the cornerstone of Victoria's defense strategy. For the first time, they could prove a clear pattern of behavior that demonstrated Victoria was a victim rather than an accomplice. The methodology is identical across all 4 cases, explained Victoria's new defense attorney, Sarah Martinez, whom Jonathan had hired using the church's emergency fund: marriage, financial isolation, gradual access to personal information, sophisticated document forgery, embezzlement using the wife's identity, theatrical escape, and abandonment of the spouse to face prosecution. But the prosecution wasn't backing down. Mrs. Montgomery's case has unique elements that distinguish it from these other alleged victims. District Attorney James Peterson argued during a preliminary hearing. The scope of the fraud is much larger, the sophistication more advanced, and the duration longer. No one could participate in a $57 million embezzlement scheme for 3 years without knowledge and consent. Victoria sat in the courtroom, listening to lawyers debate her fate as if she weren't there. The media coverage had been relentless and uniformly negative. Public opinion had already convicted her based on Bradford's carefully planted evidence. After court, Victoria met with Jennifer Walsh in person for the first time. The older woman's face bore the lines of someone who had survived trauma but never fully recovered from it. Victoria, I need you to understand something, Jennifer said as they sat in a small conference room. Even if you win this case, even if you prove your innocence, your life will never be the same. People will always whisper about you. Employers will always wonder. The internet is forever, and your name is now permanently associated with this scandal. Are you trying to discourage me from fighting? No. I'm trying to prepare you for what comes after, because surviving the legal battle is only the beginning. And what do you mean? I mean that Benjamin, or Bradford, or whatever he's calling himself now, he didn't just steal money from us. He stole our identities, our reputations, our ability to trust our own judgment. Even after you prove your innocence, you'll spend years questioning every decision, doubting every relationship, wondering if you're smart enough to avoid being fooled again. Victoria thought about the 8 years she had spent with Bradford, the complete trust she had placed in him, the way she had gradually isolated herself from friends and career to support his success. How do you recover from something like that? Slowly, with help, and by accepting that the woman you were before him is gone forever. The question is who you choose to become after. That evening, Rachel Stone called with news that changed everything. Victoria, we found him. Bradford, Benjamin, whatever his real name is. He's been arrested in the Cayman Islands on an unrelated money laundering charge. The local authorities are holding him pending extradition requests. Victoria felt her heart racing. Does this help my case? More than help. If we can get him extradited to face charges here, if we can force him to testify about his methods, we can prove your innocence definitively. But will he testify? Won't he just claim I was a willing participant? Rachel's smile was predatory. That's where it gets interesting. Bradford made a mistake, a big one, when he confessed to framing you at the wedding reception. When he explained his methods in front of 200 witnesses, he committed a new federal crime, obstruction of justice. I don't understand. By deliberately framing you for crimes you didn't commit, by planning evidence to make you appear guilty, Bradford committed federal obstruction of justice. And here's the beautiful part. We have dozens of videos of him confessing to it. For the first time since her arrest, Victoria allowed herself to hope. Bradford's narcissistic need to demonstrate his superiority, his compulsion to explain his cleverness to his victims, might finally be the crack in his perfect plan that would set her free. But even as hope flickered to life, Victoria knew that Jennifer Walsh was right. Win or lose, the woman she had been before Bradford was gone forever. The question now was whether she could become someone stronger, someone who could help other women avoid the trap she had fallen into. The legal battle was far from over, but for the first time, Victoria felt like she might survive it. Victoria's opportunity for justice came sooner than anyone expected. Bradford Montgomery, whose real name was revealed to be Brian Michael Stevens, was extradited from the Cayman Islands after 6 weeks in custody. The charges against him included wire fraud, money laundering, bigamy, and the newly added charge of obstruction of justice based on his wedding reception confession. Victoria's bail had been reduced to $500,000 after Jennifer Walsh's testimony established the pattern of victim manipulation. Jonathan had mortgaged the church property to secure her release, and Victoria was now under house arrest at his modest apartment, wearing an ankle monitor that tracked her every movement. The confrontation happened in the federal courthouse's secure conference room, where District Attorney James Peterson had arranged a plea negotiation session. Victoria's attorney, Sarah Martinez, had insisted that Victoria be present to hear any admission of guilt from Bradford directly. Bradford entered the room in shackles and an orange jumpsuit, his previously perfect appearance now disheveled and tired. 6 weeks in federal custody had stripped away the polished veneer, revealing the hollow-eyed manipulator underneath. Victoria, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You look well. House arrest suits you better than I expected. Hello, Brian, Victoria replied, using his real name deliberately. Or do you prefer Bradford? It's hard to keep track of your identities. Bradford's smile faltered slightly. I see you've been talking to my former associates. You mean your former victims, Jennifer Walsh, Caroline Stevens, Michelle Torres, 3 women whose lives you destroyed before you got to me. Destroyed is such a dramatic word. I prefer to think of it as redistributed responsibility. District Attorney Peterson spread documents across the conference table. Mr. Stevens, let's discuss your plea options. The government is prepared to offer 15 years in federal prison in exchange for full cooperation and testimony regarding Mrs. Montgomery's innocence. Bradford studied the documents with calculating eyes. 15 years. That seems excessive for what amounts to creative accounting and relationship complications. Creative accounting, Victoria's voice rose with anger. You stole $57 million from people's retirement funds. You ruined hundreds of families. I provided those people with investment opportunities they never could have accessed otherwise. The fact that the returns didn't materialize as expected is simply market volatility. Sarah Martinez leaned forward. Mr. Stevens, we have video evidence of you confessing to framing Mrs. Montgomery for crimes she didn't commit. That's obstruction of justice, which carries an additional 10 years. Ah, yes, the wedding reception speech. I may have been somewhat theatrical in my remarks. You detailed exactly how you used Victoria's identity to establish offshore accounts without her knowledge. Peterson continued. You described your methodology for forging her signatures and manipulating her into providing personal information for criminal purposes. Bradford was quiet for a long moment, studying Victoria's face. You know, Victoria, I almost feel sorry for you. 8 years of marriage, and you never once suspected what I was really doing. Because I trusted you, because I loved you, because I believed marriage meant partnership and honesty. Those are lovely ideals. Very naive, but lovely. Victoria felt 8 years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. You destroyed my sister's wedding. You caused her to lose her baby. You stole money from retirees who trusted you with their life savings. You framed me for crimes I didn't commit, and you feel sorry for me. I feel sorry for anyone who goes through life believing in fairy tales about love and trust and happily ever after. Is that why you did it? Because you don't believe in love? Bradford's laugh was sharp and bitter. Love is a chemical reaction that humans mistake for something meaningful. I studied it, Victoria. I learned to replicate the signals that trigger it, the right words, the right gestures, the right level of attention and neglect. It's remarkably easy to manipulate once you understand the psychology. So everything between us was a fake. Everything between us was strategic. You provided social legitimacy, financial cover, and emotional labor that made my business operations more effective. In return, I provided you with financial security and social status. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement until external factors required termination. Victoria stared at the man she had shared a bed with for 8 years, the man she had trusted with her entire life, and realized she was looking at someone completely devoid of human empathy. Mr. Stevens, Peterson said, the government's offer stands 15 years with possibility of parole in 12, in exchange for full cooperation and testimony clearing Mrs. Montgomery of all charges. Bradford considered the offer for several minutes. What happens if I don't cooperate? 25 to 30 years, no possibility of parole, and Mrs. Montgomery's trial proceeds with the current evidence, which strongly suggests her guilt. Victoria felt her stomach drop. Even now, even with Jennifer Walsh's testimony and the wedding reception videos, her fate still depended on Bradford's cooperation. You want me to admit that Victoria was innocent, Bradford said slowly, that she had no knowledge of my business activities. We want you to tell the truth about how you manipulated her into unknowingly facilitating your crimes. Bradford looked directly at Victoria, his expression unreadable. The truth is that Victoria was the perfect mark. Intelligent enough to be useful, trusting enough to be manipulated, and isolated enough to be controlled. She signed every document I put in front of her, provided every piece of personal information I requested, and never once questioned my explanations. Because she loved you and trusted you, Sarah Martinez interjected. Because she was naive and dependent, but Bradford paused, seeming to savor the moment. She was completely unaware of the criminal nature of my activities. Victoria genuinely believed she was signing routine financial paperwork for legitimate business purposes. The admission hit Victoria like a physical blow. Relief, vindication, and heartbreak all at once. Are you willing to testify to that in court? Peterson asked. For 15 years instead of 30? Yes, I'll testify that Victoria was an unwitting accomplice rather than a criminal partner. As Bradford was led away in shackles, he turned back to Victoria one final time. Victoria, I want you to know that you served your purpose admirably. You were everything I needed you to be. And you? Victoria replied, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. Were everything I needed you to be too. You showed me exactly who I don't want to become. The legal victory was complete. But as Victoria walked out of the courthouse, a free woman, she knew that rebuilding her life from the ruins of Bradford's deception would be the hardest challenge she had ever faced. 6 months after Bradford's confession cleared her of all criminal charges, Victoria stood in the small apartment she had rented in Oakland, staring at a letter from the Victim Compensation Fund. After legal fees and court costs, she would receive approximately $400,000 from the recovered assets, enough to start over, but a fraction of the life she had lost. The media attention had been overwhelming. "Trophy Wife Vindicated" read the headlines, but Victoria knew that public perception moved slowly. Online, she was still associated with the scandal. Potential employers still Googled her name and found stories about embezzlement and federal charges. "Victoria," Jonathan said, entering her sparse living room with coffee and the morning newspaper. "You need to see this." The headline read, "Former Montgomery tech wife starts foundation for financial abuse victims." Below it was a photo of Victoria at the press conference she had held the previous week, announcing the Hayes Foundation for Financial Independence. "I still can't believe you're using your real name for everything," Jonathan continued. "Most people in your situation would change their identity, move somewhere new." "I thought about it," Victoria admitted. "But running away would mean Bradford won. He destroyed 4 women's lives by making us ashamed of being victims. I'm not going to hide anymore." The foundation had been Victoria's idea, inspired by her conversations with Jennifer Walsh, Caroline Stevens, and Michelle Torres. All 3 of Bradford's previous victims had agreed to serve on the board of directors, creating an organization dedicated to helping women escape financially abusive relationships. "The phones haven't stopped ringing since the press conference," Victoria said, checking the voicemail on her new business line. 47 women have called in the past week. 47 women who recognize their own situations in our stories." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Madison, who was slowly recovering from her miscarriage and the trauma of her wedding day. "Saw the news story. So proud of you. Can you have lunch tomorrow?" The relationship with her sister had been strained since the wedding disaster. Madison blamed herself for asking about Bradford's business trips, convinced that her innocent question had triggered the violence that cost her the baby. Victoria blamed herself for bringing a dangerous man into their family. Both women were working through guilt that belonged entirely to Bradford. "How's the job search going?" Jonathan asked. Victoria sighed. "Difficult. Turns out former trophy wife cleared of federal fraud charges isn't a resume enhancement. But I have an interview next week with a domestic violence nonprofit. They specifically want someone who understands financial abuse from personal experience." The work paid a fraction of what Victoria had earned in her previous marketing career, but it offered something more valuable: purpose. For 8 years, her life had revolved around Bradford's needs, Bradford's career, Bradford's social obligations. Now, for the first time since college, she was making decisions based entirely on her own values and goals. "Victoria," Jonathan said carefully, "there's something else. Detective Stone called this morning. Bradford's sentencing hearing is next month. They want to know if you plan to give a victim impact statement." Victoria had been dreading this moment. Facing Bradford in court during his plea negotiation had been necessary for her legal vindication, but traumatic in ways she was still processing. The idea of standing before him again, of articulating the damage he had done, felt overwhelming. "I don't know if I can do it." "You don't have to. But Victoria, you might be the only person who can speak for all his victims. Jennifer, Caroline, and Michelle all said they would follow your lead." That afternoon, Victoria met with Dr. Amanda Foster, the therapist who specialized in recovering from narcissistic abuse. Dr. Foster's office was warm and comfortable, filled with plants and soft lighting that helped Victoria feel safe enough to explore the psychological damage of her marriage. "How are you feeling about the sentencing hearing?" Dr. Foster asked. "Terrified, angry, confused. I want Bradford to face consequences for what he did, but I also want to never see him again. Those feelings aren't contradictory. You can want justice while also wanting distance from your abuser." "Is that what he was, an abuser? He never hit me, never screamed at me, never threatened me physically." "Victoria, we've talked about this. Abuse doesn't require physical violence. Bradford systematically isolated you from your career, your financial independence, and your ability to make informed decisions about your own life. He manipulated your emotions, controlled your access to information, and used your trust to commit crimes in your name. I keep wondering how I could have been so blind, how I could have lived with someone for 8 years and never seen who he really was. Because he was extremely skilled at deception, Bradford wasn't just a con artist. He was a professional manipulator who had perfected his techniques on multiple victims. You weren't naive or stupid. You were targeted by someone who specialized in exploiting trust and love. Victoria thought about the other women Bradford had victimized. All intelligent, successful, accomplished women who had been systematically deceived and manipulated. Dr. Foster, do you think I should give the victim impact statement? I think you should ask yourself what would serve your healing process, not what's best for the legal system, not what other people expect, but what would help you move forward. That evening, Victoria called Jennifer Walsh, who had become something like a big sister in shared trauma. Jennifer, are you planning to attend Bradford's sentencing hearing? I've been going back and forth. Part of me wants to see him held accountable. Part of me never wants to be in the same room with him again. If I give a victim impact statement, would you consider giving one too? Victoria, are you sure you're ready for that? Victoria thought about the 47 women who had called the foundation in 1 week, the hundreds of women who were currently living in situations similar to what she had experienced, the future victims Bradford might target if he ever gained freedom again. I'm not ready, but I think I need to do it anyway. Then yes, if you're brave enough to speak truth to that monster, I'll stand beside you. Victoria spent the next 2 weeks writing her victim impact statement, working with Dr. Foster to find words that accurately described the psychological and financial devastation Bradford had caused without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. The statement was 3 pages long and ended with a paragraph that had taken Victoria days to write. Bradford Stevens didn't just steal money from retirement accounts. He stole years of our lives, our ability to trust our own judgment, and our faith in human goodness. But he didn't steal our strength, our resilience, or our determination to help other women avoid his traps. We are survivors, not victims, and we will ensure that his crimes serve as a warning to protect future targets of financial predators. As Victoria prepared to face her abuser one final time, she realized that the terrified woman who had been arrested 6 months ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more determined to use her experience to help others. Bradford had tried to destroy her. Instead, he had forged her into someone strong enough to fight back. The federal courthouse was packed for Bradford Stevens' sentencing hearing. Victoria sat in the front row between Jonathan and Jennifer Walsh, wearing a simple black suit that she had chosen for its professional appearance rather than its designer label. The days of dressing to impress were behind her. Bradford entered the courtroom in shackles, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he had worn during their marriage. 6 months in federal custody had aged him visibly, but his eyes still held the calculating coldness that Victoria now recognized as his true nature. Judge Maria Rodriguez reviewed the case files before addressing the court. Mr. Stevens, you have pleaded guilty to wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and bigamy. These crimes affected hundreds of victims and destroyed multiple lives. Before I pronounce sentence, the court will hear victim impact statements. Victoria's hands trembled as she approached the podium, but her voice was steady as she began to read. Your Honor, my name is Victoria Hayes. For 8 years, I was married to the defendant, though I now know that marriage was fraudulent and that Bradford Stevens is not even his real name. Well, she looked directly at Bradford as she spoke, refusing to let him intimidate her. Bradford didn't just steal $57 million from retirement accounts. He stole my identity, my reputation, and my ability to trust my own judgment. He isolated me from my career, my friends, and my financial independence, then used my isolation to manipulate me into unwittingly facilitating his crimes. Victoria described the systematic psychological manipulation, the way Bradford had gradually gained access to her personal information, the forged signatures that made her appear complicit in crimes she never knew were happening. But perhaps most damaging of all, Bradford stole my sense of reality. For months after his arrest, I questioned every memory, every conversation, every moment of our relationship. He made me doubt my own sanity by convincing me that love and trust were weaknesses to be exploited. Jennifer Walsh spoke next, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. I served 2 years in federal prison for crimes Bradford committed using my identity. I lost my house, my savings, and my reputation. When I was released, I had to rebuild my entire life from nothing. Carolyn Stevens and Michelle Torres had flown in from Chicago and Miami to give their statements via video link. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar whirlwind romances: financial control, embezzlement, abandonment, and federal prosecution for crimes they didn't commit. After all 4 victim statements, District Attorney James Peterson addressed the court. Your Honor, Bradford Stevens is not just a white-collar criminal. He is a serial predator who specializes in financial and psychological abuse of intimate partners. His crimes represent a sophisticated pattern of behavior that has destroyed multiple lives across multiple states. Bradford's defense attorney made a brief argument for leniency based on his cooperation, but Judge Rodriguez's expression remained stern throughout. Mr. Stevens, the judge said, do you have anything to say before I pronounce sentence? Bradford stood slowly, his shackles clanking in the silent courtroom. Victoria braced herself for another display of manipulation or false remorse. Your Honor, I want to acknowledge that my actions caused significant harm to the women who trusted me. Victoria Hayes, Jennifer Walsh, Caroline Stevens, and Michelle Torres all deserve better than the deception I practiced against them. Victoria was stunned. It was the closest thing to a genuine apology she had ever heard from Bradford. However, he continued, and Victoria's brief hope evaporated. I want the court to understand that my actions were driven by a desire to succeed in a competitive business environment. I never intended for anyone to be harmed by my financial strategies. Even in his moment of sentencing, Bradford couldn't admit to the deliberate cruelty of his actions. He was still reframing himself as a misunderstood businessman rather than a serial predator. Judge Rodriguez's voice was ice cold as she pronounced sentence. Mr. Stevens, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $57 million to your victims. 25 years. Victoria felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. Bradford would be 70 years old when he was released, too old to start another career as a romantic con artist. As Bradford was led away in shackles, he turned to look at Victoria one final time. There was no remorse in his eyes, no recognition of the damage he had caused, only the cold calculation of a predator who had finally been caged. Outside the courthouse, Victoria faced a wall of reporters and cameras. For months, she had avoided media attention, but today she was ready to speak publicly about her experience. I want other women to know that financial abuse is real, that it can happen to anyone, and that there is life after surviving it, she told the assembled crowd. Bradford Stevens targeted intelligent, successful women because we had the most to lose, but we also had the strength to rebuild our lives after his crimes were exposed. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the Hayes Foundation's new office space in downtown Oakland, watching volunteers answer phones from women across the country who needed help escaping financially abusive relationships. The foundation had grown from Victoria's initial $400,000 investment to $1 million organization supported by grants and donations. Victoria, said Dr. Amanda Foster, who now served on the foundation's board, there's someone here to see you. The visitor was a young woman in her 20s, well-dressed but nervous, who reminded Victoria painfully of herself 8 years earlier. Mrs. Hayes, my name is Amanda Collins. I read about your foundation online, and I think I might need help. My husband controls all our money, and I'm starting to suspect he's not the businessman he claims to be. Victoria sat down with Amanda in the foundation's comfortable counseling room, thinking about how different her life might have been if such a resource had existed when she first noticed red flags in her marriage to Bradford. Amanda, you're safe here. Tell me what's been happening. As the young woman described her situation, the financial isolation, the psychological manipulation, the growing suspicion that her husband's business activities weren't legitimate, Victoria realized that every woman they helped represented a life saved from the destruction Bradford had specialized in creating. That evening, Victoria sat in her modest Oakland apartment, reading emails from women who had found the courage to leave abusive relationships after hearing her story. The apartment was small and simply furnished, But every piece of furniture was chosen by Victoria herself, paid for with money she had earned through her own work. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Madison's number. Victoria, I have news. Jake and I are pregnant again. 12 weeks. We wanted you to be the first to know. Victoria felt tears of joy streaming down her face. After everything Bradford had taken from their family, life was finding a way to heal and grow. Madison, that's wonderful. Have you thought about names? If it's a girl, we want to name her Hope, because your courage to fight back gave our whole family hope that we could survive what Bradford did to us. Victoria looked around her small apartment, at the foundation's business cards on her coffee table, at the photos of the women she had helped escape abusive relationships, and realized that Bradford had been wrong about everything. Love wasn't a weakness to be exploited. Trust wasn't naivety to be manipulated. And hope wasn't a fairy tale to be destroyed by cynicism. Victoria Hayes had survived the perfect trap. And in surviving, she had become strong enough to help other women escape before they fell into similar darkness. Bradford Stevens would spend the next 25 years in federal prison, but Victoria would spend the rest of her life free, helping other women claim the freedom he had tried to steal from her. The woman who had once been afraid to question her husband's business activities was now fearlessly exposing financial predators and saving lives. It was the perfect revenge, living well, helping others, and proving that even the most sophisticated manipulation could be overcome by courage, community, and the refusal to let evil triumph. Victoria's real life had finally begun.